All right, so on to basics of ecology. As always, starting out with definitions. So what is ecology? The root words of ecology, the ology, the suffix, always means the study of something. Ology, biology, the study of life. Ecology literally means the study of the home or the house. And so in the bigger picture, what we're talking about is the earth. If we look at it more from a sort of a perspective of what scientists look at ecology as, is it's the study of how living things interact with each other and how those living things interact with the environment around them. So it's the interaction of living things with other living things and living things with the non-living part of the environment, water, soil, climate, that sort of thing. So we look at all the different sort of interactions animals have with plants. Obviously, plants are food to each other, to animals. Plants compete with each other for space, for light, for nutrients in the soil. But we also have to kind of consider things like how the natural environment interacts with humans. Sometimes science or certain parts of ecology don't really consider humans part of the environment. But certainly we are. I mean, we live in the environment. We have a greater ability to change the environment in a way that no other animal can. And there are a lot of animals that have actually adapted to living in with humans and are probably even more numerous now than they were prior to there being so many of us. So again, we're looking at a really broad area of science that just is again looking at how living things interact with each other and with the environment that they all live in together. And again, of course, we are part of that environment as well. So ecology is basically study of ecosystems, the study of the home, the house, the earth. So what is an ecosystem? And so this basically includes the living stuff, the biota, bio, life, and then of course the living stuff interacting with the climate that's around them, both on the broad scale, global, regional climates, and microclimates or topoclimates, climates that occur that are different in one small area than they are in another area nearby because of mountains or valleys or different landforms. And then of course that also includes the soil, which obviously is the medium that provides plant life, the ability to grow. Also, of course, we're looking at the water cycle, the groundwater, lake streams, rivers, etc., all the way down to the bedrock that ultimately is the source of all of the soil that eventually feeds the plants, that eventually feeds the animals. So again, as ecologists, we are studying everything from a very broad regional climate, like looking at the Mediterranean climate of California, all the way to the bedrock that ultimately, again, forms the soil and everything in between. So again, other than the biota, all of the rest of these components are the non-living or abiotic components. Again, the bedrock forms the soil that ultimately provides the plants with their medium for finding water, nutrition, etc. The groundwater that ultimately collects from rain and snow percolating into the soil. That groundwater eventually moves through the soil profile laterally, ends up in a nearby lake or river, or ultimately the ocean, where it might circulate for thousands and thousands of years before it evaporates and goes back into the sky, completing the water cycle. A lot of people think of soil just as dirt, Dirt's what you have on your clothes that you want to wash out. Soil is the medium that provides the foundation for plant life to get everything they need. And again, without plants, obviously, there wouldn't be animals. Soils are very complex. There are thousands of different types of soil. You kind of think of animals, plants, different species, different types of plants, different types of animals. There are actually a lot of different types of soil, and each one of those soils have different, different aspects about them that allow different types of plants to grow or different types of animals to exist in them. Some are very fertile soils, some are not, but a lot of people don't realize just how diverse soils are. And then, like I mentioned, with the topo or sort of microclimate, you can have the general climate of a region, but then you can also have climates that are different in some areas within that region. Valleys can affect climate in a lot of different ways. Obviously, it's always warmer down here in the valley around Redding, Red Bluff, etc., than it is in the foothills or up in the mountains. A bunch of different reasons, but a big chunk of that is the topography that affects the climate. Down south in the San Joaquin Valley, there are areas where you'll see certain trees growing, like orange trees, citrus trees. Those only grow in areas that we kind of call banana belts. Those are areas that, because of the topography, they just don't get as cold as some of the surrounding areas. And citrus trees are susceptible to the cold. And so then again, you'll have the same thing with native plants. Some plants living in certain areas that are a little moister than another area nearby. Others might prefer areas, microclimates that are a little drier than maybe other areas, warmer, cooler. But all those little topo climates or microclimates have a huge impact on the living things. We'll talk more about landform later, and we just finished the section on climate. So the big regional, climates that are the long-term trends. Again, much of California having what we call a Mediterranean climate. And so all of these factors interact to basically determine what type of plants and what type of animals can live in an area. So you've got these living things, the biota interacting with each other and with the non-living things. So if biota or biotic refers to living things, then we put the letter A in front of something, again kind of going back to Latin roots. It sort of means the opposite of, or not. So non-living things are the abiotic things. Now sometimes you'll have people arguing that soil is a living thing because it has living things in it. And the biotic component of soil is big, and it has a big influence on building soil. But soil itself is made up of minerals, decomposed rock, and so soil itself is a non-living thing, as is water. Again, water might contain living things, fish, reptiles, whatever, but water itself is just made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and so it is also an abiotic factor, but again, a very important one. Obviously, water is maybe the most important resource on the planet for life on this planet. Then you have all the rocks and the minerals. Certainly minerals play an important role in humankind because of our exploitation of those minerals for our daily lives, either certain things like gold that we value or other minerals that we might use for cleaning clothes, phosphates, or sodium chloride, salt that we use as a spice or a seasoning. And then all the rocks, of course, that ultimately weather and are the sort of the parent material of soil. So without that material weathering, we wouldn't continue to build new soil. We of course have all the other gases that occur in the atmosphere as well. Carbon dioxide that influences the carbon cycle and plays a huge role in things like climate change. Nitrogen, also a naturally occurring gas. It's the majority of the atmosphere is nitrogen. But you also have the problem when nitrogen is generated by burning fuel, internal combustion engines like we have in our cars, and then we dump an excess amount of that gas in the atmosphere, also causing pollution that can be hazardous. But all those gases that are in the atmosphere are again playing a huge role in the type of life we have on this planet. The differential heating of the planet that we talked about, creating ocean currents and wind currents, but also in conjunction with the atmosphere and the gases that are in the atmosphere, create a planet that exists within a range of temperatures that's conducive to life. It's not too cold, it's not too hot, but it's just the right temperature for life to occur. We'll look at light more in a minute as well, but plants are ultimately the source of all life on the planet, or the vast majority, because that's what provides food for everything else that can't make their own food. And of course, without light, without the sun, plants wouldn't be able to make that food. So ultimately, we all are dependent on the sun and the light that it sends our way. So we can look at three broad categories of ways to classify the living parts of an ecosystem. I just mentioned that plants utilize sunlight. They also utilize carbon dioxide gas and water. And ultimately, those plants in the presence of sunlight are able to build glucose, a simple sugar made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we consider plants to be in the category of being a producer because they produce their own food. And again, because animals like us can't produce our own food, we depend on plants to be able to convert sunlight and water and carbon dioxide into food, simple sugars that we eat, that other animals eat, we consume. So we're actually considered consumers along with a lot of other life on the planet that are all kind of in the category of being animals. We consume other living things, and then our bodies break down those organic molecules into their individual elements, and then we rebuild them into the stuff that we need: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, all that kind of stuff. So the second category is considered to be consumers because we have to consume other living things. And there are typically many levels of consumers: primary, secondary, tertiary, maybe 4, 5, 6 even, depending. And then, of course, a very important category are the decomposers. So these can vary from anything like mushrooms, which are fungi. Mushrooms break down organic material, so plants or animals that die get broken down to provide the food for the fungus, and in turn that fungus then has its energy source so it can grow. But it's also helping the ecosystem as a whole because it's taking these big organic molecules and breaking them down into smaller ones so that other living things can then have that molecule for their needs, for their growth needs. Things like bacteria as well, microscopic single-cell bacteria, are very important in the role of decomposing once living plant or animal material. It starts kind of on a big scale. Things like coyotes or eagles or vultures that are scavengers that only, well, eagles eat living things as well, and coyotes do as well. So, but they also are scavengers. They'll eat things that are already dead. Those big things start the process by breaking up some of the larger bits of plant and animal into smaller bits, And then the flies will lay eggs and maggots will feed and be part of the decomposition process. And then, bacteria and fungi jump in also as things are being broken down from a whole living thing into the individual macromolecules that make up that living thing. So all three of these categories are dependent on each other in one way or another. But again, remember ultimately that it is the sun's energy that life on this planet is dependent on. Again, even though we can't make our own food from the sun, we are still ultimately dependent on it because we depend on those producers to use the sunlight to make energy, and we consume those producers, or some living thing like a cow consumes the grass, and then we might be a secondary consumer that eats the cow, or you might have an energy pyramid where you've got vegetation, you've got mice that are primary consumers that eat seeds, you've got a snake as a secondary consumer that eats the mouse, and then you might have a red-shouldered hawk that's a tertiary consumer that eats the snake. What's important, though, is realize the shape of the pyramid. The base of the pyramid is really wide, right? A pyramid can't exist upside down. It would tip over, right? You have to have a wide base to support the rest of the pyramid. And that literally means that you need a lot more producers than primary consumers. And you have to have more primary than secondary, and more secondary than any other number above there. And so as you have more levels, if you were to have a fourth or a fifth level consumer, there would be much less energy available. So very productive ecosystems like coral reefs or tropical rainforests have a really wide base on the pyramid, which means they can have a lot of primary consumers, and they can have a lot of secondary and quite a few tertiary and maybe even fourth and fifth level consumers. But in very simple ecosystems that don't have as much plant life in them, the number of producers is much less, so there can't be as many primary consumers, and that may mean that there are only a few secondary consumers, and maybe not even any third, fourth, fifth level consumers, because again, there can only be as many levels at the top as there are at the base to support them. So the wider the base, the more layers there can be in an ecosystem. So that sun's energy is always flowing from the plants through the different levels of consumer. And every time you go from one level to the next, there's less energy available to transfer. Eventually, there isn't enough energy any longer to feed another layer, another level of consumer. And so that's where the pyramid for that ecosystem would stop. Of course, anywhere along this pyramid that a producer dies or consumers die, then those decomposers recycle the nutrients back to the soil, which means, of course, then those nutrients are available for the plants again, fertilizer basically. And so that process still feeds back always to the producers through the process of decomposition. So here's a pyramid that actually has some fairly simple data. You have an ecosystem where the primary producers are a variety of trees, say in this case might be ponderosa pine and Doug fir and maybe black oak. Got some shrubs, maybe manzanita, buckbrush, something like that. You've got ferns, grasses, wildflowers. If you had about the equivalent of 9,000 kilocalories available, and that would be, again, food in the form of plants that's there and available for something to eat, something like a deer or a squirrel or a mouse or a bird or whatever. And again, just So focus on the number here and the trend that you'll see. 9,000 kilocalories per square meter per year that's available in the first level here that are the primary consumers. What that means then is that only about 10% of that number, so 10% of 9,000, right? You take away 1 0, which is 900. So basically, you only have about 1/10 of the energy that's available down in this producer level that actually makes it to the next level. That's why the pyramid starts getting narrower. Less energy available. So that also means that when you go to the next level of consumer, now you've only got about 90 kilocalories per square meter per year available as food sources for a secondary consumer. And again, notice the pyramid's getting narrower because there's less energy available. By the time you get to a third level consumer in this ecosystem, you're down to about 9 kilocalories per square meter per year. 9 kilocalories. How many kilocalories do you think a bear needs per year or per day to survive? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to maybe 5,000 kilocalories. So you multiply this out times, 400-500 square meters per year just to meet that 4,500 calories per day. So again, just try to think about how much area. If you only get 9 per square meter and you need more like 4,000 per day, now imagine how much land this bear needs to walk in order to find enough food, whatever it is they're eating. Some of it could be plants, berries. Some of it could be grubs, insects. Some of it could be squirrel or deer, mice. It could be any of these other animals possibly, especially if they find a dead animal, they'll scavenge it as well. But that's why the pyramid keeps getting narrower and narrower, because not all of the energy that's available actually makes it to the next level. So again, only about 10% of the energy that's available at one level, by the time it passes through these animals, makes it to the next level. So in other words, in this kind of habitat, with this much food available as plants, you could only support maybe one top-level predator per however much area it takes for it to find its necessary calories every year. So remember, the sun is necessary for the producers. The primary consumers are also referred to as herbivores because they're plant eaters. Vor, like carnivore, or herbivore means plant, plant eater, vor. Secondary consumers are all considered to be carnivores, or they could also be omnivores. They might eat plants and animals. Some things like a bobcat are going to be strictly a carnivore, whereas something like a coyote would actually be an omnivore. They would eat plants and animals. By the time we get to a third level consumer, we're looking at the same thing. Carnivores or omnivores. Bears are definitely examples of omnivores. But remember, all of these levels are dependent on the amount of sun, and the amount of sunlight dictates how much producer you can have. And then the amount of calories available per given area per year in the plants is going to dictate how many different consumer levels you can feed. Again, eventually, if you're losing 90% at every one of these levels, how many kilocalories would be available to a fourth level consumer up here? It would be less than 1 kilocalorie per square meter per year. So it would be hard for a fourth level predator up here, fourth level consumer. It would be hard for them to find enough food to be able to subsist on. All right, so a good point to take a quick break. It's always good when you're studying, when you're reading, when you're listening to lectures, that every so often, maybe every 20, 30 minutes, you just kind of stop and think about something other than whatever it was you were just doing. Get your brain kind of reset. Allows you to kind of purge your brain, because it kind of gets full, like the RAM on our computer maybe gets full sometimes. So by hitting the reset button, you can start over and have a fresh perspective on things. So taking a break, listening to, picking a song on the iPhone or whatever to listen to, just one, but one of your favorite songs, and then come back to the lecture. So we'll go ahead and move on now. So like I've said before, and probably will say again, science, biology, ecology, natural history all involve a lot of terms. And again, these terms are basically, or they can seem like a foreign language. We're talking about producers and consumers. We're talking now also throwing in the word trophic levels. So each one of these layers, the producer layer, the primary consumer layer, secondary consumer, third level, and if there were fourth or fifth level consumers, each one of those layers or levels is called a trophic level, which basically means feeding level, the level in the ecosystem sort of where you are. So again, plants are in the producer level. A top level consumer like an eagle or a bear or possibly a human would be maybe at the tertiary level. The more energy, the more sunlight that there is for the producers, the more primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers that you can have. So again, near the equator, where there's more consistent sunlight, you can have much taller pyramids. You can have more trophic levels because you've got more energy at the producer level. The farther you get towards the North or South Pole, the less sunlight you have, the fewer producers you have. So you may only have a primary consumer level, or maybe up to a secondary consumer level, but you can't have nearly as complicated ecosystems near the poles as you can near the equator, because again, it's all dependent on the amount of sunlight. So again, trophic levels are the feeding level of a living thing within a given food chain. So we'll talk about food chains and food webs, probably again things you've heard of before. But each one of those trophic levels, producers, primary, secondary, third level consumers, are all individual trophic levels within a given ecosystem's food chain. So we have a few more ways we can break down these living things. Again, we talked about plants being producers. We also can call them autotrophs. Again, Latin there. Troph again means food. Auto means kind of self or one. And so these are living things that can make their own food, make food for themselves. And obviously these are plants like we've been talking about, but also algae. It can be a very important autotroph for aquatic ecosystems that basically serve as the equivalent to plants on land that feed everything else in the water systems. It can also be photosynthetic bacteria, small single-celled bacteria that make their own energy from the sun. Phytoplankton as well that feed even things as large as whales. But autotroph make their own food. The other category of living things, or the other way that we can organize living things, would be into those that are considered heterotrophs. So like different food. In other words, they can't make their own food. They have to eat it. whether it's something that was alive or decompose it, decompose something that's dead. So again, animals fit into the consumer category, and bacteria and fungi all fit into the category of decomposers. But all of these are heterotrophs because they can't make their own food. They depend on other living or once living things for their food. And then the animation kicks in. In the section on weather, we talked a little bit about the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle, which basically tracks water from the atmosphere to the surface of the earth and then eventually back up to the atmosphere. We can also look at ecosystems in a very broad sense with respect to what are called bio, geo, chemical cycles. Bio meaning life, geo referring to geology, moving through the earth, and chemical referring to the fact that we're talking about molecules, chemicals such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen, etc. And so these are cycles that constantly occur. Things like these chemicals get cycled or recycled or reused through the environment. Plants and animals use these elements for our survival, and then when things die, those decomposers recycle the nutrients back into the soil or back into the atmosphere, or eventually they're used to build life again. So nutrients, so things like carbon dioxide, water, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, all cycle through the environment. Those are molecules that are used over and over and over again, and they're reused over and over and over again. You also then have the energy that is in the food that living things eat. So once plants use the sun's energy to make glucose, and then animals or primary consumers eat that glucose, that energy is going one direction. And then when something else eats that cow, that energy flows into that living thing, like a human. When we die, since not a lot of humans fortunately get eaten by other things, that energy flows out as heat. I mean, we're warm-blooded living things, so some of the energy that we eat is used to keep our body temperatures up, but that energy is just lost to the atmosphere, right, as we lose heat from our bodies. And so that energy just flows in one direction. So it's key to remember that nutrients cycle. The nutrients that feed plants and animals go round in circles. They cycle constantly, but the energy just passes from one trophic level to the next in one direction, going from a more concentrated form coming from the sun to a less concentrated form, which usually is the loss of energy as heat. And so eventually that energy just gets weaker and weaker and weaker as you go up the trophic levels from a producer to a primary to a secondary to a tertiary consumer. That energy gets less and less available until finally there's so little energy available at the very top of that pyramid, and so there can't be any work done. And so basically that means there's not enough energy to feed another trophic level. So here's just one example of a really generic cycle showing how energy or nutrients, for example, cycle through the environment. Geologic processes that build soil and minerals and things are being put into the soil. From the soil, those nutrients are available to a plant. So fertilizer, basically, if you garden, right? these nutrients that are built by geologic processes are the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, everything else that a plant needs to be able to grow, along with the sun's energy, of course. And again, that energy flows to producers and then out as heat. What's left flows to consumers. Some of that's lost as heat. The rest of it, nutrient-wise, gets then broken down by detritivores. Some of that energy is lost, or lost to the big picture cycle here, where again, some of those nutrients go right back to producers. Some of those nutrients go back into the soil, where eventually they may be used by a producer. Main thing is, notice that if this were a generalized cycle of an ecosystem, basically it's a closed loop. All of the nutrients that are being built by the soil are being put in the soil. Any nutrient that comes out of this reserve or reservoir that gets used by a plant and eventually by a consumer, no matter what happens, whether the consumer loses that energy or heat or whatever, all of those nutrients cycle back around one way or the other. So just a couple of these biogeochemical cycles. So again, we looked at the water cycle, same idea for these cycles. First one is carbon. The carbon cycle in the big scale is very important to things like climate change, but also the carbon cycle is important to understand just from the standpoint of again, energy flow and trophic levels. So you could start anywhere, but let's start up in the atmosphere, because that's where the source of the carbon is. All of the carbon that feeds the carbon cycle comes from carbon dioxide. Again, it's the CO2 that plants utilize to photosynthesize. So they're taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere, along with water, sunlight, to make plants. And then you have those primary consumers that eat the plants. You have the higher level consumers that eat the primary consumers. Eventually, plants, animals, all are going to die. That energy is going to get recycled through decomposition, where then those, again, nutrients are available to in that reservoir to be able to feed plants again. Same thing is happening in the water, by the way. Fish, other aquatic living things live, eat each other. They eventually die, decompose, release carbon compounds back into the water. And eventually, whether it's through respiration, when we exhale CO2, right? Plants take it in to make energy. We breathe it out as a byproduct, and then it goes back into the atmosphere, where it cycles again and will forever. One other thing, though, to consider here is burning fossil fuels, right? Just happens to show a ship here, but this could be PG&E power plant, burning fossil fuels like gas, natural gas, or coal, or some sort of petroleum product. Could be a forest burning naturally, releasing carbon dioxide. It could be automobile emissions, cars, ships. What's going on there is we're taking carbon that's been stored long term as fossil fuels, right? Plants, animals, dinosaurs that have died, millions of years of geochemical processes that create fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are meant to be a long-term storage that balances the amount of carbon in the ground with the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So the problem is when we start digging all that fossil fuel out of the ground, where it could never come to the surface as much as we do by digging it out, and then we burn it, what's happening is you've got the natural carbon cycle going around and around, and it's balanced between the air and living things and storage. But then you start pulling a bunch of it out of storage and throwing it into the atmosphere. So we as humans, and we see the effects now as climate change, that we're upsetting the carbon balance, and we're only beginning to understand what types of impacts that'll have. Also, nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is also in the atmosphere. It's captured by specific types of plants and bacteria. Plants like beans and peas can actually grab the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it so that it's in a form that can be used by other living things. The form is NH4, ammonium, and nitrates, NO3. So without plants or the bacteria that can grab these things, nitrogen that's in the atmosphere isn't in a form that can be used by living things directly, except for, again, certain types of plants and certain types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these guys have a very important role in making nitrogen available, and that nitrogen then of course is an important element that plants need to grow, which of course then feeds the different levels of consumers, as well as ultimately the decomposers. So again, notice we've got a closed loop, nitrogen going from the atmosphere, flowing through plants, animals, decomposers, stored in the soil for a period of time to be used by those plants, and then as plants and animals die, and the denitrifying bacteria help break down living things, then those gases as nitrogen are re-emitted to the atmosphere, making the circle complete. So maybe just another way to look at this, that again we have all these chemicals, these biogeochemicals that involve carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, water even. And these are cycles that just keep going round and round. The same carbon atoms keep getting used over and over. Carbon atoms that are in your body could have been a carbon molecule in a dinosaur at some time in the past, or could have been in a redwood tree. So all these chemicals are constantly cycling. Meanwhile, you've got light energy, of course, that has to be used by plants to make chemical energy that can be used by animals. So plants, again, are converting light energy to chemical energy. And in the process, as living things live, they give off heat energy. So again, you have energy kind of moving one direction through an ecosystem. Right? You've got a terrarium in your house, and it's closed, a little closed system. So this could represent the entire Earth. You have sunlight coming in. You have plants making chemical energy. Animals can then use that chemical energy. In the process, all life is giving off weaker energy. So strong energy, it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker until eventually it's lost as heat energy. Heat's too weak to do any work any longer. And then within this Earth, or within this ecosystem, you have these cycles where, again, the same carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus molecules are being used over and over and over again, and will as long as, too many buttons. Like we see these guys, right? They're on this maple, perhaps, big leaf maple, and they're eating the plant. That's how they're getting their energy, right? So on average, for every 100 kilocalories that caterpillar eats worth of plant, again, think where all of that energy goes. If a bird were to eat this caterpillar at some point during the caterpillar's life, would it be able to harvest every single calorie that caterpillar has ever eaten? And obviously the answer is no, right? again, maybe think about it from a human perspective. If we eat 2,000 calories a day, and those calories are never used by our body, we would just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and be 10,000 pounds eventually, right? We know, and again, I'm being silly, because we know our bodies use that energy, and that's why we have to keep eating. Some of that energy gets lost in what's called cellular respiration. Every one of the cells in our body needs energy to be able to make molecules, make proteins, copy our DNA. And so that's basically the putting some fuel in your gas tank, and part of that fuel gets burnt and part of it doesn't get combusted. So on average, about every 100 calories that a primary consumer eats, about a third of them are lost just to keep the body alive. Basically, that's what cellular respiration is. It's the basic energy that's needed for a living thing to stay alive. Almost half of the energy that's consumed is actually lost just through feces for this caterpillar. So obviously it eats food, it processes the food, and then there are waste products generated, stuff that can't be used by your body. So a big part of the energy is lost just as feces. And then, of course, the example of a caterpillar, they eat, they go into a cocoon stage, their body changes or metamorphosizes into a butterfly. All living things grow over time, and so the remainder of that energy, about 15%, is used to grow. And that, grow bigger, grow new bones, grow hair, grow everything. And so obviously of all of this energy, none of this is usable. None of the feces are usable by a bird that eats the caterpillar, right? Some of the growth can actually be harvested, right? The caterpillar grows and then a bird eats it. The respiration can't be utilized because, again, you can't eat the respiration, the byproducts of a cell being alive. So really it's just the growth mostly that's being harvested by something that's eating something else, which again is around that 10%, right? 15% obviously of this number, but that's why it's as low as it is, because so much of the energy is lost as heat or other stuff. If we eat a cow, we don't actually eat the bones, right? We don't actually eat the hair on the cow or the skin on the cow. We don't actually eat all of the organs, right? So we're only eating the sort of edible parts of the animal. And so again, a lot of this energy is just not available or lost. So basically, any trophic level is just harvesting the growth of the food item that it's eating. So a couple of examples here: a terrestrial food chain, terrestrial meaning land, marine obviously meaning water. And again, we're going to have producers, various levels of consumers, a fourth maybe, quaternary, or maybe a fifth or sixth, depending on how diverse the ecosystem is. But so start thinking about this then. Pick, your backyard. We've got a food chain here, right? A specific plant being eaten by a grasshopper, being eaten by a mouse, the mouse being eaten by a certain type of rattlesnake, the rattlesnake being eaten by a red-tailed hawk. That's one food chain within the ecosystem. You start looking at all of the different food chains, because there's more than one type of plant probably in your backyard, right? There probably are dozens of insects that you don't even know about. There could be a lot of different carnivores at the secondary level. There could be a number of different third-level consumers, and maybe even several fourth-level consumers. You could have the red-tailed hawk, you could have red-shouldered hawks, you could have great horned owls, you could also have things like coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, black bears. So you look at all these individual food chains, whether it's in the ocean or whether it's on land, and you start putting those all together, you can see how complicated, how complex an ecosystem can be when that's just one of maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of different food chains. So again, here's basically another energy pyramid just showing the amount of energy that's available from one level to the next. We've talked about the same topic probably 3 or 4 different ways in the last 20 minutes. But the reason I'm doing that is because it's a really important concept to hammer home. That everything on the food chain, every trophic level that's up near the top is dependent on every trophic level below it, ultimately the plants, and then really ultimately the sun, right? But again, just trying to reinforce how little energy is available from one level to the next. When this mouse eats the grasshopper, there are parts of this grasshopper that the mouse can't digest, right? The outside shell of this grasshopper is made out of chitin. Same thing basically like cellulose. If we eat plants, our bodies aren't built to break down plant material like, say, a cow could. And so, you know, the little bristles and the external skeleton, this mouse is just going to poo it out because their bodies can't break it down and use it. When the snake swallows this mouse, the snake is going to digest the mouse, but again, bones don't digest, or at least not completely. The hair doesn't digest. So when it eats this whole mouse, it's not even, if the mouse weighs 300 grams, that snake is not getting 300 grams worth of calories, right? Or kilocalories. It's losing kilocalories that were put into making hair and bones and teeth and, you know, certain other things that are just not usable. So again, the idea of the 10%, only 10% of the energy available at one trophic level is available to the next one. And eventually, far enough up the trophic level, there's just not enough energy left to support another layer of consumer. So again, when we start putting all these food chains together, of which there could be dozens or thousands of in an environment, again, the closer to the equator, the more complex these food chains can get, and therefore the more complex the food webs can get. So as ecologists or natural history people, we have to start by studying individual living things. You know, we study this cactus or this species of chipmunk or that species of insect or that species of mesquite tree. We start trying to make connections, one food chain where this Gila woodpecker is dependent on this species of cactus, the flower of it, for its fruit. Very simple little food chain here. Primary producer, primary consumer, and that's the end of that one. But are those the only 2 living things in this desert? No. Are these the only 5 plants in that whole desert? Well, no, right? I mean, there could be dozens or hundreds of different species of plants. So we have a line of 100 different plants. Is this the only 2 mammals, this one species of rat and this species of chipmunk? Probably not, right? Are these the only 2 or only 3 types of insects? Probably not. So we have hundreds of plants, maybe dozens and dozens of primary consumers, and eventually maybe only a few top-level consumers. But you can see how quickly complicated we can get in an ecosystem if we start trying to look at all of the food chains and put them together to look at a food web of a given ecosystem. Again, this is a very, very simplified version of a desert ecosystem and the interactions. And again, notice the snake, if we kind of go backwards, the snake doesn't just eat one possible food, right? The snake might eat this species of mouse. It might eat this species of kangaroo rat. It might eat this species of chipmunk. It might eat a bunch of different things besides what are even on this little food web. Some things might be very specific, like this Gila woodpecker might only eat the fruit on the saguaro cactus. but or this species of lizard might only eat this species of rodent. But generally there are many connections, and again you can see how quickly tracing the arrows and keeping track of everything, how quickly it can get um, confusing. So basically food webs are nature's way of trying to get back energy, trying to recapture wasted energy, right? You've got the plants that are using sun's energy. You've got those plants being eaten by the three-armed chipmunk there. I don't know what the hell that thing is. You've got the droppings. The nutrients from that can be fed back to the plants to feed acorns. Of course, squirrels, chipmunks will take acorns and bury them as well, and then some of those never get found. So basically, they've planted new trees. Then you've got the third trophic level, the secondary consumers like the fox that would eat the chipmunk, or maybe some beetle that would eat the droppings of the squirrel. You've got those droppings again that are nutrition, right? They're nutrients. Those nutrients are lost energy to the fox, but the environment is trying to recapture those nutrients by recycling them, decomposers recycling them, and those nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, so forth, being put back into growing a new plant. That is probably a dung beetle there. So you have all of these things feeding on everything else. Every step along the way, nature's trying to recapture energy, either through droppings, when the animal or the plant dies and it's decomposed. Not only feeds the decomposers, but then those nutrients are cycled back to the soil. So decomposers really play a huge role in nutrient cycling, in making ecosystems work. Oftentimes we don't think much about this aspect. Maybe it's because humans don't like to think about death, and that's certainly understandable. But everything that's alive on this planet is going to die. And when it dies, it's going to be partly or wholly, the attempt is going to be, again, nature's attempt is going to be to recycle that thing back so that as much of it as possible can be reused. Remember though, even foxes like this or coyotes or anything serve as decomposers as well sometimes. Because if they're eating something that's dead already, and many animals are scavengers, if that's the food that's available, they start the process by breaking down a large thing into smaller things, as well as serving as consumers. So the main message of this chapter was to really get you to understand that nutrients cycle through the environment. They're constantly cycling, and they have been for billions of years, and they will continue to cycle for billions of years. You could be drinking a glass of dinosaur pee from 60 million years ago. Of course, fortunately, the 60 million years has allowed that water to be purified. But again, basically saying that any given carbon molecule on this planet could have been through any number of different living things before it got into your body. But then also remember that the size of ecosystems is limited by energy flow. Energy flowing from the sun through plants, through different trophic levels, ultimately determine how diverse an ecosystem can be, how many trophic levels there can be in an ecosystem. So energy flows one direction, whereas nutrients cycle. And the amount of energy available at the bottom of the pyramid is going to dictate how many different trophic levels there can be in an ecosystem. So the next section that we'll be talking about deals with biotic communities. So looking at the different ways that we classify plants and plant communities. And we'll look at the biotic communities around the planet, the biomes, and the types of factors that make them what they are. So that'll be up next.